I grew up in California, and the area that I grew up in, it wasn't a good area, you know. And I grew up with a lot of anger, and I became a fighter. My stepfather was a very abusive man to me, and he used to, whip me all the time and put me down with words. And he would hit me and hit me and hit me, and I would hold them tears in. And after he was done, I would go in the backyard, inside of my house, and I would start to cry. And I had so much anger built up on I would say, I wish I can kill him. I was 13 years old when I started selling drugs. And by the time I was 19, I was facing 4 years in prison for the sales of PCP. And I ended up doing a year inside the hole. I paroled out of San Quentin. And I said to myself, I ain't never going back to that place. And one day I was with some friends and we're driving down the street and I saw this girl. I told my friends, man, you see that girl? We began to date. And as we were dating, she says, you can't date me unless you take me to church. I said, church? She goes, yeah, you take me to church. I said, okay, we'll go to church. So I took her to church and we drove up to the church, the old Victory Chapel on Boulder and Weber. And when I parked in the parking lot, I could hear the tambourines and the drum and the guitar and the people singing. And I'm like, I don't know about this church. I've been to a church like this. And when we left that church, I told my wife, I said, that pastor that preached, by the way, was Pastor Jones. I said, that man preaches the truth. I said, but he preaches it with love. Debbie and I got married October 27th, 1985. I held this secret inside of me, that I never confessed to anybody. I didn't confess it to my wife. I didn't confess it to God at the altar. I was on the run from California, and they were looking for me. Well, I remember Pastor Jones preaching one time, your sin will find you out. And it did. It was a couple of weeks later that I was at my parole hearing, and she was there. And we're sitting in the parole hearing, and they want to give me another year in prison, plus another 3 years of parole. And so I was able to argue my case before them, and I just began to tell them, hey, while I was in Colorado, I was able to meet Jesus, and he changed my life, and I began to tell him the things that God has done for me, and he gave me a wife, and I have a little child, and I've been doing good. And the reason why I left was because I didn't want to live in prison for the rest of my life, and I didn't want to die in prison. And the only way I knew how to escape from all of this was to leave. They came up with their decision. They decided they were going to cut me off parole, release me, no strings attached. Other than that, I go back to Colorado because they didn't want me in California anymore. We started going back to church, and lo and behold, I backslid again. Started going back to my old ways. And then my wife began to pray and ask God, God, reveal my husband's sins to me, because at that time she believed in only divorce through adultery. She said that's what the Bible says. I could divorce if for adultery. And she began to pray out to God, and God, show me his sins. And he did. She was delivering newspapers with my niece. And she seen my car parked out there. She knew where I was at. And she came in there and she caught me. And when that happened, it was like my whole world just fell apart. I never loved anybody. That's the most hurtful thing in my life. Because you know what? She's the only one I ever loved. I didn't even have that for my own mother. When she left that house, I wanted to chase her and tell her I would change. But I knew it wouldn't work. Not this time. So I got my keys and I left. I drove up to Gold Camp Road. And I was going to commit suicide. I said, when I finish this bottle of Jack Daniels, I'll be drunk enough to drive my car off that cliff. And nobody would know the difference. They wouldn't know it was suicide. They just another drunk individual that drove off the cliff with thoughts of ending my life. I go through the glove box and I'm fumbling around and I find this tract. And I begin to read the tract. And I read it 3 times. But on the 3rd time, the back of that tract, I had the sinner's prayer. I said the sinner's prayer. And then I said it again, and I read it again. And then the 4th time, I said that sinner's prayer, and I said, God, if you're as real as those people in that church say you are, then do something for me. I need you to do something for me now, because if you don't, it's over. Tears become out of my eyes, and all of a sudden, this bright light, I could see a bright light. I knew if I opened my eyes, I wouldn't be able to see. And all of a sudden, I feel this lightning, this joy and this peace. And I felt God begin to hug me. And I threw that bottle of Jack Daniels over the cliff. I got into the driver's seat of that car and I began to go down the hill, and I could feel this joy and this peace in my life. And I drove up to where my wife was at. And I got out of the car and I told her I got saved. She looked at me and I said, no, I got saved. No, for the first time in my life, I got saved. And she just got up and walked in the house, and I went to church and went to church. Then I got out of church, went back, and I tried to talk to her. She wouldn't talk to me, and for weeks I would drive by and invite her to church. I'd be going to church, and she wouldn't come. Then one day her niece came out of the house, and she said, I'll go to church. Come on, Debbie, let's go to church. And she got in the car, and she went to church. And we were sitting up in the balcony, and we're listening to the preaching. And right in the middle of the sermon, Pastor Jones looked me in the eye, and he pointed right at me. And he said, God's going to restore all the years. And he prophesied over me on that. Debbie was there, and she began to cry. I began to cry, and from that moment on, things began to change in my life. Jesus has made all the difference. I'm never going back.